So, we're approaching Matan Torah, so we'll try to say something evolving around that. The title was like a very, very general concept of mental balance, Michal balance. We'll put it off a very famous midrash that refers to Matan Torah, and it says that like Chazal break reality or history, the span of history, into three. And the 3/3, like three categories that Chazal categorize, the 3/3 of time is that the initial state of reality up until Matan Torah. So like the first 2 millennia of reality are called Shtei Alfim Tohu, 2 chaotic millennia, like a very long period. It's categorized as chaotic. And then the antithesis of chaos, as we'll try to explain a little bit, is Torah. So the second 2 millennia, the second third of the span of history, Chazal called Torah. So there's Alpaim Shana Tohu, two millennia of Tohu, of chaos, and then 2 millennia of Torah, and then 2 millennia of Mashiach. So we're already deep into the end of the third trimester of this birthing process of Mashiach. And it's all categorized as some sort of messianic project, as we'll try to contemplate on this. But Matan Torah, like the occasion we're approaching, is very explicitly pronounced as the antithesis of the initial chaotic stage. And therefore, what we'll contemplate on, in order to see like what is the Torah, how does it antithesis? What is it doing? Or what is the segula, or the capacity of the Torah to mitigate the chaotic initial state of reality and of ourselves? Obviously, everything coexists on all scales. So whatever we find in Ha'olam Gadol, we also find Ba'olam Katan Ze Adam, like Chazal say. So we'll try to contemplate it more on the individual level, and then also reflect on it on our historical spans. So because this is the category that Chazal use, this word tohu, which is explicitly a very, secretive or Kabbalistic term. It's not something that's usually interpreted or elaborated upon in Chazal. Usually, the phrase is used. It also appears in the Torah, of course. The Torah starts and says that when Hashem created the earth, and it was initially tohu vavohu, that there was this chaotic state. It's not explicit that this was like the typical categorization of the first 2 millennia. It's just sort of like this first stage, but also in the Pshat of the Torah, you see that there's an initial seminal stage that's categorized as Torah, and Chazal say that the residue, or the categorical inspiration of this chaos remained something that became the typical characterization of reality for 2 millennia. Until Abraham comes around, and he's like the seminal appearance of the Jewish people in the Torah, and the culmination of these 2 millennia is the Matan Torah on Mount Sinai. And therefore, when Chazal want to categorize it, this is what they call it. The second trimester is called Alpaim Shana Torah, and what it's doing is rectifying the previous chaotic stage in order to eventually reach a holistic perfection, or however we'll try to describe it, of what's called Mashiach. So in order to contemplate on this, we need to understand all categorizations. Well, what is the initial seminal chaotic state? What is the Torah looking to do in order to balance that? That's why the title we gave is the Torah, in the light of this, is a balancing attribute, which is true. I also try not to throw too much terminology, but just again to have like a good framework in our minds. So it also has to do with Sfiras Omer. Now this is the time where we also, in our working up to the Matan Torah, then we also delve into the inter-inclusion between the Sfirot every night. It's one of the only kavanas that, I think there are only 2 kavanas that the Alter Rebbe brings in his Siddur. One of them is in the Haggadah of Pesach, which is once a year, and the other one is the Sfiras Omer. The only 2 explicitly Kabbalistic kavanas that the Alter Rebbe brings. The Rebbe was always very explicit on how, if the Alter Rebbe brings something, so it's obviously in his mind that this is something that is suitable and relevant to every person. And also, so this is also a period of time where we explicitly focus on this inter-inclusion of the mitzvot. One of the main things it's reflecting is this concept that the Torah is a inherently third or triangular concept. Okay, Orient Litai. It's even on the third month. In the Torah, it's the third month. We're approaching Sivan, which is the third month of the Torah counts from Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. It's the third month in the Torah itself. Chazal says Orient Litai, Bechodesh Litai. The Rebbe was also very, very big. The Rebbe loved the number 3, maybe his favorite number, Chazaka, and a Chazaka Sheba Chazaka. And it's because it's typically the most Toradic number. And why? Because again, 3 is, as we'll try to explain, it is like an identified third position, is balancing a premature, seminal, chaotic state. So the first stage of anything is always a dual, like bipolar. It has edges, ktsavot, extremes, just 2 extremes, and it doesn't have a well-defined center. And this is like the definition, if you open books of Kabbalah, so the definition of an unbalanced, chaotic state is that it has 2 edges, and it doesn't have a well-defined center. Now, again, obviously between 2 edges, there's always a center, but it's as long as it's not well-defined, it's a hypothetical center, it's just like the gray area in between the edges, but the only well-defined constructs are only at the edges. So any concept, and this is something very, very general, we'll contemplate on it in a certain angle, but any concept that is dual, tzvei dinim, is inherently a chaotic concept. In order to balance a system, the simplest, the most obvious image of this, which is what the Zohar states, is like a scale. That if you want to balance a scale, then you have to pivot it on top of a centerpiece. So if they're just extremes, then it's going to tilt. But if you put something in the center, if you manage to define and characterize a center, then the center, it's called matkala, that's the phrase in the Zohar, that the point of matkala, the point of balance, is always it demands, like if I were to take this table and I want to balance it on a pin, so I would have to, again, there is a center here, but it's not well defined. And in order to be able to balance it, I would have to define and characterize and identify the precise center. Now, again, edges are something that are intuitively defined because they are intuitively apparent. And a center is intuitively not defined. We'll explain this in a second. But if you think about it just in geometry, it's very simple. We try to reflect this a little bit more in our nefesh, so it's something that needs a little more thinking. But this is something basic, and therefore the initial stage, like our intuitive approach, will always first realize edges, and that creates like a chaotic state where you go from edge to edge, like a bipolar state. And in order to manage or refine and balance a system, what needs to be achieved is an identification of the center. Now, at the end, this is something that we'll try to refer to as in the flyer. It says that this is a new way of reading. I don't know if it's so new, but another angle of how to read the entire dynamic of the book of Tanya. So in a way, if you're a little bit familiar, and I assume you are, because it's the last venue on this trip, and happily enough, it's more of a Torah-oriented place. So I hope I'm right that I can. All the other classes we gave, most of them were more like lecture type of kiruv classes. So here, I'm allowing myself to use more explicit terminology of limud. I hope that's palatable. So if you're familiar with Tanya, and also a little bit familiar with what preceded Tanya, like with the conceptualization of the Avodas Hashem before Tanya, and in some areas of the world even after Tanya, but not Tanya. So what basically the Alter Rebbe's Chiddush is again, psychologically, on the psychological level, the ability to identify a middle which is not just in between edges. Okay, so like the concept of the Beinoni of the Tanya, what it was up until the Alter Rebbe, was conceived upon just as what's between the tzaddik and the rasha. So they're actually, it's a bipolar state, a bipolar approach of how I see reality. That there's this edge and there's that edge, and inevitably there is a circumstantial center, right? So if you're in between those 2 edges, then you're bein lebein, you're between. But it's not something defined in of itself. It's just like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's like a compromise. And what the Tanya, all of the Alter Rebbe's thesis, if you would, is all to present the centerpiece as a well-defined character that is not just in between two other edges, but he has faculties that define him and differ him in of himself. And by doing so, if as we'll hope to explain, by doing so, what you achieve is balancing the entire system. So as long as I treat myself and others and reality only as a bipolar system, which is, as we'll explain, my intuitive tendency. All of our, like Chazal say, that the initial stage of reality is always like that, always tends to this chaotic stage. That's how we tend to view things, and then we suffer these chaotic consequences, as we'll explain. Again, the consequence of tohu in Kabbalah and Chasidut is a breaking, like trauma. Right? So as long as you have a bipolar view of anything, then that system will inherently shatter and will need to be recuperated. And in order to stop this process of breaking and recuperation, what you have to be able to maintain is a well-defined center. That is the Beinoni B'Tanyan, and then that center becomes the centerpiece, which actually balances the entire constellation, as we'll try to depict. So in order to describe this, what we want to contemplate on is the process of how an initially chaotic state develops, how it would by default develop, and how a mindful intervention, like what the Torah is, like a mindful, conscious intervention, can mitigate the deterioration process and also stabilize the entire system, even recuperate it and enhance it. So in order to contemplate on that, we'll take it as a psychological process, as something that happens to a person, which is the main mashal, the main contemplation always in the Torah and Chassidus, mi b'sari yachzeh loka. And we'll see how all of these faculties correspond to a person's life. So if we want to take a seminal state, which typically should be chaotic, so the easiest way to depict that is just to look at the person's seminal state. Like you take your childhood, or hypothetically you take you yesterday. Well, we're going to take your far yesterday because it'll be more apparent. I mean, the further back we go, the more these characterizations will be explicit and apparent. So if we want to characterize what a child is, again, according to the definitions that I'm phrasing here, so the first 2 millennia of life relatively are chaotic. That's the definition we're saying. So the first 2 millennia of any system, the first trimester of any system, is relatively chaotic. Now, what's the definition of a chaotic state? So I'm going to introduce a little bit more terminology just because it exists, and it's usually very familiar in Kabbalah circles. So the Rebbe loved this terminology, used it a lot. That appears in the Arizal, that a chaotic state is characterized by orod merubim v'kelim matim. That's usually the phrase, an abundance of lights or strong lights, and narrow or premature or again non-developed vessels. Okay? So narrow, premature vessels. So you have an abundance of lights and premature vessels. What is this? How does this play out in childhood? Again, very typical of a juvenile mentality. That the child is, on the one hand, lights is like cheshek or vitality or gumption, yearning. So a child is typically full of chayus, full of drive. He has a lot of lights, a lot of oiros, but usually, typically, all of that vitality, all of that drive is being funneled into very narrow vessels. So vessels is like lettering, like narratives. Right? So he funnels his very strong drives typically into a very narrow, one-dimensional, stubborn even image. So like an infant wants a popsicle, and on the one hand he wants it very, very much, and only a popsicle. Okay, so he's taking a lot of vitality, he's taking a lot of will, which is, again, there's something magical about that, something good. It's not necessarily good or bad. Okay, chaos is not, the word tohu does not correspond to the word evil. It's not something bad. It is, as we'll depict, inherently unstable. But this is first just to let the concept resonate a little bit. So again, a child or an infant, relative early stage in life, what you're going to find is always relatively an abundance of light, so a lot of energy, a lot of vitality, a lot of will, strong gumption, and it's going to be funneled typically into a very narrow image, right? The phrasing, he's phrasing it, like the otiyot is how I phrase myself. And so what do I want? The images that I'm funneling my energy into are going to be very, very premature. So they're also narrow, well-defined, not flexible. So like that example I said, so a child, he wants his candy, and he's capable of wanting it very, very, very much, but what he wants is very, very specific and uncompromising. So the kalim, the images, like the boundaries, the specification that the light is being funneled into, that's called kalim, are very premature. And obviously, like this is a very stereotypical example, easy to understand, that such a state of mind is inherently unstable. So there is a very strong likelihood that on occasion he will not get the candy. So that's called shviras hakelim. The narrative will break. The image or the scenario that he is funneling all of this vitality into will shatter. That's called shviras hakelim. Now again, we took a very minor example of a very specific scenario. If we take this on a more existential level, so it's not just that he's funneling his vitality into a practical scenario, I want candy, it's more to contemplate on how a person funnels his entire energy into a certain image of who he is and what he wants, something very existential, but still, when you're a child, that narrative and that image is very one-dimensional and steadfast, and inevitably it's prone to breaking. Now this is the typical categorization or the typical characterization of infanthood, or of, again, a preceding stage. Like if I look in the past, and every one of us, if you look in your past, and as we'll explain, relatively, also yesterday is more like this than today. Okay, so every day, every moment, you're going from a relatively chaotic state to a relatively post-chaotic state. Every moment. Okay, so like I said, the easiest example is to look at your childhood. Let's take this child a little bit further. After he breaks, like the recuperation in Kabbalah, the Olam HaTikun, the phrase for Olam HaTikun, which is how is usually categorized our reality, like the present state, just like chaos is a typical phrase to categorize the past tense. Like if I think of my past, then I'll always find it relatively chaotic to my present. My present will always be relatively a recuperation, a rectifying, like a post-traumatic state. There's always like this breakage in my background, and my present experience of self is the recuperation of this background of trauma. So the past shatters into the present, and my experience of my present is always a recuperation of these smithereens. Now the process of how this breaks is actually very, very specific, and in the Arizal, this is one of the 4 most elaborated topics. So it goes on and on and on of exactly where each piece of your personality flies when you smash into smithereens. Not so relevant to us right now, just the general concept that we're going from a dynamic of orot merubim, of a lot of vitality being funneled to very narrow narratives, a narrow one-dimensional personality or scenario. And where that's going to is relatively the opposite. So the characterization of the post-traumatic state is that there are orot muatim, there are dimmed minor lights, vekelim merubim, but an abundance of mature, broad vessels. So what would this look like? Again, if we try to contemplate on this as something that we can relate to, something in our psyche. So if you take this same child that went through this breaking process where he doesn't get his candy, maybe we'll take a somewhat more relatable example than a 6-year-old. So let's say you're a teenager or early. Again, anyone can just think about earlier stages in life. So typically, you still, relatively to today, you are most definitely very much like this. What do I mean? That let's say you had to choose where to go to college, or you had to choose what to do for shlichus. Okay, so at the end of high school, they gave out a pamphlet, and you had to fill in 3 options of which college you want to go to. Okay, so you can very easily imagine a teenager that his parents learned in, I don't know, Yale Law, and his grandfather learned there, and his grandmother learned there, his whole family learned there. When he wrote down the options, he said Yale, Yale, Yale. That's the only, like, it's all, again, there's a lot of gumption, he's very active, he's capable of funneling a lot of light, but it is typically being funneled into a narrow, uncompromising scenario. So this is a chaotic state. And adolescents and juvenile states are typically this way, relatively, again, anything. So a teenager is probably relatively less like this than a 6-year-old, but he's still probably more like this than we are today. So again, any scenario I think about in my past will always be typically like this. Now, what happens to this teenager? So sooner or later, he's probably not going to get, let's say he doesn't get into his law school, okay, or whatever it was that he was funneling all of his vitality into. So maybe sometimes it does work out, but at some point, like we said, this is inherently prone to breaking. That's called shvirat hakeli. So a state where you have an abundance of light into two narrow vessels is prone to smash at some point. So let's say, hypothetically, we'll take this child, we'll say this teenager, he doesn't get into his high school. So what does he experience? So again, I'm kind of, in a nutshell, reading through all of the results. So his lights, they mistaleh, which means that they kind of get sucked back inwards. So all of his vitality dissipates. Right? So he goes from being, like the kalim break, right? So the scenario shatters. That's what breaks. And when the scenario shatters, like he doesn't get in, that was his scenario. So he doesn't get into that high school, that college he was going for, strongly. And when that happens, so all the lights get sucked back into their source. So he just kind of loses all his motivations, all his gumption. So suddenly he goes from being like this active counselor and friend and popular guy to locking himself in the room and pulling the quilt over his head for a while. So all of his vitality disappears because when the scenario shatters, so all of the vitality disappears back into the nefesh. And actually this process in Kabbalah is called dying. So relatively, I mean, hopefully you don't act, it could be fatal to a certain extent, but hopefully these processes in life, these stages that you go through time and time again in life, then you don't actually die from them, but relatively this is called dying. So all of your vitality, it dissipates. When the kalim, like the body breaks, so the neshama dissipates. The same thing happens on a relative scale. So when all of his vitality, when the scenario breaks, where he's funneled all of himself in the scenario, when it breaks, so all of his gumption and drive just dissipates, and he finds himself dead or half dead in bed. Now let's say he has, I don't know, a good Rebbe or a psychologist comes and helps him out. There's a whatever, something happens and it takes him out of bed. So when he recuperates, if he recuperates, and hopefully he recuperates, so what sort of state of mind would he recuperate into? So like we said, there the definition the balance would flip relatively. So he'll have dimmed lights, with broader vessels. So if you take this teenager who just didn't get into his childhood dream of college or whatever it is, and he survives it, and he comes out of the room after a week, and his mother comes up and says, "Oh, it's so good to see you, and we're happy you're alive." And then at some point you kind of say, "Okay, so what do you think you'll do next? Where you're gonna go learn?" So you'll hear typically a completely different tune. Suddenly he'll say, "No, there are many good places to learn. There are many good things to do." Like the vessels, the scenarios broaden immediately. On the one hand, which is like a good thing, but on the other hand, his ability to recruit an abundance of vitality and go for something very strongly dims. That's called, they're dimmer lights. So on the one hand, it's like he's much more flexible in his scenarios, how he's going to phrase his life, and what images he's funneling himself into suddenly become much more mature and flexible and compromising. But on the other hand, it also compromises his ability to go very strongly on something. Now, this is like a replicating process throughout life, and this is called a chaotic state of mind. That you go through shvira v'tikun. So we probably all survived the 6-year-old candy scenario, but we went through it, and then we went through everybody with whatever scenario. Everybody goes through these scenarios, and what happens in this process, in a sense, this is what society typically calls maturity, right? This is called becoming mature. But actually, inherently, what's happening isn't maturity. All that's happening is you're just growing older. Okay, if we take there's no actual change in the system. It's just a gradual entropic process of compromising the edges of your personality. So every time you go through one of these rounds in life, and again, I gave 2 relatively drastic examples, but we all go through this all the time, like constantly throughout life. We go from a chaotic state to a post-chaotic state. And in the middle, there's a breaking. And because that breaking is somewhat traumatic, it's unpleasant, then what we do when we recuperate is that we don't recuperate fully. We maintain like a scarred psyche where we sort of mitigate our boundaries a little bit. We iron out the edges of who we are. So next time he comes out of bed, this kid, he's not gonna allow himself to go all in as much as he did last time. A little bit. Every time it's just a tiny little bit. But like his ability, his mental ability to complete, like when you're 6, you can just, right, you can dream, you have radical edges. Right? So in one day you can dream that you're going to be a cowboy and a Chabad Shliach and a baseball player. No problem. It's just like the edges of your personality. And you can wake up in the morning and be utterly disappointed and hysterical on the floor. Okay, so you have very high highs and very low lows. But as you go through life, because the process involves like this is something we'll have to dwell on a little bit more, but it involves this breaking in between. So each round scars you. Each time you go through this, like this disillusionment, you go very strongly on something. You devote yourself. You funnel your entirety of yourself into this scenario, and it breaks. And every time it breaks, even if you survive it, it scars you. So next time you recuperate, you got your gumption back, but even you might not be aware of it, but there's some setback in your willingness to devote yourself. So it could be very, very thin and delicate, but over time and time again, then it dramatically affects. Right? So if when we were 6, we could go all the way from being an astronaut to having a tantrum on the floor in 20 minutes. So when you're 90, if you change the type of coffee at home, you're going to have a heart attack. So it's like, I've punted before, life is like the image on a monitor in a hospital. That you start off with big peaks, and then slowly but surely it kind of zeroes into a flat line, and that's it. Now hopefully it takes 120 years. It's a gradual process. But in a sense, what's happening is you're inherently, there's a phrase like that in English, right? You're dying for the day you were born, not a very optimistic phrase. But there is this like nature, this inherently entropic nature of creation, of reality, which is reflected also in biology and chemistry and also in psychology, that we actually are dwindling, like we're ironing out into a flat line. Oh, again, hopefully slowly and gradually. And not only is this happening, but in a sense, culturally, intuitively, this is what we call balance, right? So the child, he's chaotic, he's unstable, and he's also very intimidating to a grown-up. Again, our intuition, not only is this what's happening to us, but in a sense, this is intuitively what we think should be happening to us, right? So, I mean, you can take the radical examples of like psychiatry, that if you're too manic, they'll give you a depressant. If you're too depressant, they'll give you a manic. But even if we don't go like to the radical edges, just the norms of life. If somebody walked in the door right now and he was very, very excited, then everybody would feel an intuitive need to calm him down. It's just something we do. And if someone walks in here and he's very depressed, then we're all going to feel this intuitive need to cheer him up, because we have this inherent intuition to zero into the center. And all this is like a post-traumatic compromise of our personality. Like I could ask about the initial 2 stages, like the seminal concept that I introduced of chaos, like juvenile chaos, and I don't want to say mature, because mature is a good word, but like a later or old stage, an older stage, right, where there's wear, the system has its wear, and it stops working so well. So which one is better? Like what's a better state? Chaos, tohu? Like, when the Rebbe has a very famous phrase that he said in his last years, right? The Recept. This is the Recept for bringing Mashiach. So he made that up. That's not written anywhere in the Arizal. I mean, both edges are written in the Arizal, but they're never written together. And nowhere in the Arizal does it say that there's such a thing as chaotic lights in developed vessels. That's a concept the Rebbe made up. What the Arizal like I said before, he says that the chaotic stage is typically where you have intense light in premature vessels, and a post-chaotic stage is where you have broad vessels with dimmed lights. Chaotic lights in broad vessels is a phrase that Rebbe made up. So he obviously took it from the Arizal, but he very intentionally took two countering or paradoxal edges in order to depict his image of what balance is. So it's not at all what we call balance. So what we call balance, like I said, inherently is just going from chaos to post-chaos. Right? So if you're chaotic, your edges are too bipolar, then we're just going to iron you out. So the more, now again, like if I take it to the radical flat line, then everybody gets sort of, okay, that doesn't make sense. But in the middle, you get like a good 20, 30, 40 years of life where you feel balanced. But what's actually happening is just in the middle of a deterioration process. So in the middle stage seems reasonable enough that you can tolerate it, but what's actually happening is you're just in a gradual deterioration. So you're not really balancing the system. You're just going through a gradual, hopefully it's gradual. If someone goes to a very, very severe edge, okay, so it might not be gradual, it might shatter you. But most people, in normative scenarios of life, then this entire process is gradual, but inherently there's no real balance being introduced into the system. It remains a bipolar system. And the inherent result of that is that in the go-betweens, merging from side to side, every time, in every scenario, you get a setback, you get like scarred. And next time, you're not willing to go that low, you're not willing to go that high, and therefore your edges sort of zero out. Now this is what we call balance. When the Rebbe wanted to describe balance, he said something completely different. Because that's a very interesting concept. But if I were to ask, just before we get to what the Rebbe said, just in a basic, like intuitive sense, what is better? What's more appealing, right? I mean, like I said, these phrases of chaos and rectification, they don't mean good and bad. But if I were to try and judge them, measure them intuitively, then what is better? Again, a person with strong, intense lights and very narrow vessels, or a person with dimmed lights and broad, flexible vessels. What do you say? Okay, so there's something that it's like responsibly we should say that the second one is better, right? Like the broad, flexible, mature vessels with the dim light. But intuitively, when you phrase it that way, I mean, the juvenile state is much more appealing. It's not the. Also, the Rebbe, when he said his phrase, he didn't say both edges equally. Right? The term he says was "Iris the toe, obe bekilim the tikkun." So the kelim the tikkun was just ober. You need iris the toe. It has to be bekelim the tikkun, but that wasn't like a determination. That's not the inyan. It's just a necessity. Like there's this ober bekelim the tikkun. That's how the Rebbe phrased it. So if you think about it for a second, this juvenile state is much more attractive, much more. My grandfather, Alav Shalom, who lived across the road, so this can be the schusay. So this is probably one of like my only distinct memories, conversations with him. But he had this like joke, like a humoristic pun he used to say a lot, that he'd see the kids running around, the grandkids, and he'd say that youth is wasted on the young. That stayed with me. The youth is wasted on the young. It's a beautiful sentence. So okay, so there's something much more appealing, take, about the chaotic stage, right? So, but on the other hand, so why don't we let 16-year-olds run the country if they're so appealing and attractive? Because it's just inherently unstable. So there's like, again, the post-traumatic state is a necessity. It's not so attractive, it's not so valuable, but it's aber, okay? You can't do without it. It's like a necessity to get to that. But really what's happening here, like we said, is it's a deterioration process. So it's important to be able to sense that we are compromising extremely valuable sides of our personality when we go through this kivyachol maturity process. So this intuitive default process that we go through and we call maturity is actually compromising the most valuable aspects of our personality and of our lives. And when this compromising deterioration continues enough, eventually we really just shut down and flatline. Until Mashiach comes, that's what's happening. So that's what's happening biologically, it's what's happening psychologically simultaneously. Now, what a true balance, like introducing true balance into the system, hypothetically, would aspire to mitigate that problem, like to solve the problem of death, which is just a basic Jewish aspiration. Today, it's even semi-scientific. Like there are, you can already start seeing stems of realization that a deterioration process is not a dire necessity. It's not complete. It's not a definitive necessity. So even like humanity is starting to cope with that, but that's like basic Aleph base from kindergarten, that we're going to solve this death temporary issue. We're not. So it's as much as it's true biologically, which I don't yet know exactly how to implement in a laboratory, but it's getting there. But as much as it's true biologically, it's tenfold. Implementing this in how we balance our neshama is definitely something very accessible. This is the basis of what we'd call balance. And like I wanted to say from the beginning, this is actually what the Torah is coming to do, like introducing a conscious awareness into the default pattern of life is looking to mitigate this inherent fluctuation, which causes a deterioration process, and to solve it. That's what Torah is all about. The Orient Litai, it's the third middle. Like I said, in order to balance a chaotic system which causes this bipolar back and forth, which scars us, what we need to do is identify a center, like realize a well-defined third party, the Beinoni, the middle balancing point. Why? So that's what we want to explain. Okay, so in order to explain that, we'll delve a little bit more into details of what we described. Okay, what is actually happening here in the process? When I go from edge to edge, what exactly, why is it accompanied by a compromise? Like, why is every, let's call it every round, I don't know how to call that, right? Every time I merge from side to side, so like we said, typically I don't go as far as I did last time, and therefore it creates a deterioration process. But why is it that when I go back and forth, I end up not going as far? So if we specify that more than what we just described, then what we'd say is, and again, everybody has to kind of cope with, bear with me to try to feel this out, that a person, again, you have highs and lows, right? As a binary, life is highs and lows. And like you wake up in the morning sometimes and you feel like full of gumption. Let's just take simple examples, right? Not you wake up, you feel great, you're in a good mood, right? You're going to do big things. You're going to bring Mashiach, maybe even on Mashiach a little bit, right? You have all sorts of people have all sorts of aspirations, full of dopamine. You're full. Okay, great. Now, 2 hours later, even 20 minutes later, you could find yourself typically. This is very typical. This doesn't make you clinically ill. This is just normal. This is just normality, right? Then 20 minutes later, you feel like if you get out of bed, it's going to be a miracle. Okay, so this is typical life. Now, what happens in the process of this merging from side to side? And this is like a microcosm of what we just described. So this happens every day. Every day, these breaking, these shatterings of the vessels, we depicted them on large-scale events of life, where I'm going to go learn, what I'm going to be, who I'm going to. So, but it's something that it happens as often as we breathe. Right? I don't know. You step into the street, and a car scoots by, and it scars your confidence. Every day, there's a constant. Again, I'm not saying to be timid of this, just to realize that there is this dynamic happening, and it's an accumulative process throughout life, and it would do us very good to balance it more correctly. So we're taking a simple scenario. I woke up in a good mood, and then I got into a bad mood. Okay, let's say I'm giving a class. So let's say the class is successful, and everybody says, "Wow, that was such a deep, profound class." So I'm very, very happy. And then I don't know, somebody asks too much questions, so I get angry. And I go, "Stop asking those questions." I embarrass myself. I feel awful. And okay, this is what happens in life, right? So we go from edge to edge. Now, if you follow the process, you follow the experiential process, then what you'll sense is that naturally, like innocently, when I find myself in a high, I naturally identify, like people tend to just identify with a reality at face value, right? So when I find myself full of gumption, then I adopt that image of self. I'm a labeled guy. This is who I am. I'm a tzaddik. So we'll use the phrases of Tanya. Okay, so when I'm high, then I adopt that definition of self. I identify as that thing. And also, when I'm low, and I'm in a down, I also identify. Again, I'm not manipulative. Most people just very innocently, right? So I also identify. I'm nothing. I'm worthless. Now, that's up until now. That's all sensible. But because I identify with the current state that I'm always in, then each pivot, like each merge from side to side, is inevitably in the background accompanied by like a stinging sense of disillusionment. Because when I wake up in a high and I figure I'm a labeled guy, and 2 minutes later I find myself feeling worthless. So it's accompanied by, in the background, like in the back of your head, it's accompanied by a sense of that I was misled. What I thought yesterday, a minute, that was all wrong. Actually, I'm worthless. So the breaking, like we said, the breaking of the previous vessels, like that were a second ago, are what you, in adopting a new image of self, you inherently compromise your previous image of self. So when you were in a high, you identified, and that's going to happen again. So now you're in a low, and you think to yourself, I was delusional. And next morning you wake up and you're feeling good again, and again you say, why did I feel that I was so, again, it's not phrased out completely, it's not something that we completely have phrased, but the experience of going from edge to edge is typically accompanied with every time with a slight stinging disillusionment, like a feeling of I was played again, right? I was delusional. And that sensation is what scars you. And because it's accompanied with this sense of misled disillusionment. So that's what like creates a tendency to be deterred from those edges. Because it scars my confidence, it scars my innocence to take reality at face value. So I kind of take a step back. So even though next morning I'm willing to feel good again, but I don't trust in that feeling as well, because I've been disillusioned so many times. And each time that disillusionment, it gives me another, like it strengthens or enhances my tendency to hold back a little bit. Again, it's not something blunt. Like if you went through a very serious trauma in life, it could be very explicit. But I specifically don't want to talk about like clinical states, because it's not like that. This is something that is across the board. Like everybody is constantly going through this in life, and that's why some people, chas v'shalom, die of a car accident at 16, but everybody kind of dies at 120. So the process is always happening, and there's something that the reason we compromise our edges, like that's the image here. And both edges, our highs and our lows. And a child is just as capable as he is of aspiring and devoting and dreaming, is also capable of being exposed and hysterical. And so everybody in this room, just like we don't aspire as high, it's been a while since we laid down on the floor and had a tantrum. That's also something we don't typically find ourselves doing in our late 40s, because we compromise, and we compromise both edges, and both of them are assets that we're compromised on. It's not just a matter of how to get more highs, it's a matter of how to expand the broad of your personality, of your neshama, of who you are willing to conceive of yourself as being. And this is and like I said, not only is this the process we're going through, this is intuitively what we actually call balance. So we're even unconsciously encouraging this. Like I said before, that's the easiest example. If I see someone too high, I am intuitively prone to try and iron him down. If I see him too low, I'm gonna try and cheer him up. Now, like if you open Tanya, then you'll see that the other Rebbe is doing the exact opposite. If you're high, he kind of throws you into the next atmosphere, and if you're down, he steps on you. It's very counterintuitive, not what you'd expect, but he's looking to enhance your edges. And not only is a mitigation of extremes not conducive of mental health, this is actually the process of deterioration of mental health. Now, again, if it's managed maybe reasonably, so it takes a reasonable period of time, but it's still a deteriorative process. And what balance would be solving this deteriorative process. Now, in order to do that, that's why I mentioned that specific point of what exactly is the catalyst that's causing my deterrence. So that the catalyst is the accompanied sense of disillusionment that accompanies every shift in life. Okay, so it's not the high or the low, it's the sense of being played that I allowed myself to be played, and that compromises your edges. And that's why, because it's always accompanied with this stinging, scarring sort of disillusionment, that's why next time I won't allow myself to this low either. So if we answer or right give a recept to solve, to mitigate the disillusionment that accompanies our mergers, then we would stop the deterioration process. And if it's a good enough recept, then we'd also be able to recuperate all the broth that we've lost and maybe even stretch it some more. So what is that? That is the base definition of what the Alter Rebbe is trying to describe when he talks about a Beinoni. But again, a centerpiece, a third, like the third line of Kabbalah, which is what differs the world of chaos from the world of Tikkun, that there's a middle line, which is a well-defined middle. And what is a well-defined center? Okay, what would you need to do in order to go through, again, the turmoils of life? We're not looking to rid ourselves of that. The opposite, we're looking to enhance them. So it's not the edges that are the problem inherently, like we said. The problem is how we experience the go-between, the accompanied disillusionment. That's the problem. Now that happens, that occurs to me because I go through each stage in a manner where when I'm high, I just kind of buy into it completely. I identify completely. So if I'm feeling very high, I feel like, oh, okay, so I'm a tzaddik. And then when I fall, I feel like, oh no, I'm not. It's like I'm a Rasha. And then when I recuperate again, I'm like, why do I think of myself as a Rasha? I'm a tzaddik. Again, every time, this is a very innocent process. It's not something malevolent or malicious. Nobody's planning this out. But intuitively, this is how we react. So every time I find myself in one of these edges, I just naturally identify with it. So, and that's why I feel disillusioned every time. So what balance would constitute of is adopting or phrasing, maintaining a image of self that would be able to contain and explain under one narrative, under one umbrella, both my highs and my lows as constituting one personality. If I didn't have to substitute my sense of self every time I went from one edge to the other, then I wouldn't be scarred in every merge. Does that make rational sense? Again, the reason I feel this disillusionment is because each edge contradicts what I thought of myself a moment ago. So if I were able to constitute an identity that contained both edges under one coherent explanation, who I am can make sense of both my highest highs and my lowest lows without needing to reassess who I am, without really needing to compromise my entire concept of self, then I wouldn't feel this disillusionment every time I pivot from side to side. And this is like the base definition of how the Alter Rebbe is describing a Beinoni in Tanya, that he wants to give a well-defined center which can explain the highest experience of a tzaddik and the lowest, deepest, darkest edges of a rasha as being a coherent part of a holistic spectrum of one personality, so that you can rid yourself of your tendency to be disillusioned of yourself every time you go from side to side. Now, in practice, this is something that very likely is only feasible under relatively small proportions. What do I mean? If you try to take your 6-year-old with his cowboy and tantrums, right? He's very, very big and attractive and very nice, but very unstable edges. And bring him to this class and explain to him that no, you need to bend and you have this edge of it. I said, okay, I mean, good luck with that sort of thing. So it's just not feasible. Again, not inherently. I mean, there's no definitive rule that says that you can't balance a radically chaotic system. Hypothetically, if you could phrase and identify with a very, very intricate personality that could explain that, then you would rid yourself of that disillusionment. But it's going to be very not feasible. It's very difficult to balance, especially if you're a juvenile, if you're a child. It's going to be very difficult to balance that. So there is definitely, in practice, a necessity to compromise some of the volume of the personality until it reaches a point which is balanceable, right? Or feasibly balanceable, practically balanceable. And even in the description of the Arizal of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world, so he also kind of went through, like it didn't go smooth. He also had to try a couple of times until it worked out. So there is something that by definition. Why am I mentioning this? Just to say that the intuitive initial concept of balance, which is just a compromise of edges, it's not inherently evil. There is even a necessity. Like saying if someone comes to a psychiatrist and he's completely bipolar, there's no one to talk to, so there's nothing wrong with giving him pills to calm him down a bit, but not as a solution, just as a temporary compromise in order to reach a point which is manageable. But this is not managing. That's what I'm trying to say. That a temporary stage of reaching a compromised state that can be managed is not part of managing it. It's just setting the grounds in order to create actual balance. So also in life, it's very likely that your ability to balance yourself, it becomes feasible only after you've compromised some of your juvenile radical edges. But as soon as possible, what you'd want to do is first stop the deterioration. And doing that would demand of you to phrase and identify, adopt an identity that contains simultaneously your current high and low. So it could be that it's taken some time in life until you reach proportions that are containable. It's very likely that that's the case. But it's, as soon as possible, at some point, you want to constitute a identity that explains your highest high and your lowest low as part of one personality. So you're not disillusioned when you give a great class and everybody's very excited, then you know how to funnel that. And when the second later you come out a complete idiot, it also makes sense under the same rationalization of who I am. Now, if it doesn't, when I come off an idiot, it contradicts the high I had a moment ago, then I will find myself compromising my edges again, because I'll get that scar of disillusionment that will inherently cause me to step back. So in order to not scar myself time and time again, I have to reach a point where I can maintain a personality that doesn't catch me by surprise, or doesn't disillusion me on either edge. And like I said, reasonably, this is something that happens in a later stage of life. So there is, again, a first chaotic trimester. There's like inherently a first third of life which you can't really manage without compromising until you reach a manageable proportion. Okay, so it's a deterioration process, but you're deteriorating into something manageable. If you just keep deteriorating, then you just flatline. So that's not good. And so any deterioration, we'd like to say any deterioration is bad. But feasibly, it's a necessity. Right? So that's exactly the description of the span of history. That there are these 2 millennia of necessary deterioration until you reach a point where you can presume to introduce balance. Like you could hypothetically start introducing a image or a moichi, like a state of consciousness that could contain both edges, and then stop the deterioration. And even more so, what we consider balance would be once you stop the deterioration, then the more of a healthy image you have, the more you can start recuperating the grounds you've lost, and maybe even enhancing it more, right? So definitely, I mean, go as high and as low, and that's just good. Somebody's got to have to be the Mashiach at the end, right? So you got to have, someone's going to have to go to very radical edges to solve this problem. In order to do that, there has to be a middle ground of balance. Now, like I said, feasibly, that middle ground is in between a deterioration, like it stops the deterioration process, and slowly but surely ignites a recuperation process. And then, though, if you enhance you recuperate all your lost chaotic juvenile lights, and you even enhance them more, then what you get is a messianic state, which is what the Rebbe phrased as Od the dough of Bebekeli V'Tikkun. Okay, so this process, like this necessary process, which shatters and softens, kind of lalouche, and it softens the boundaries of your harsh initial frameworks of your juvenile kelim, phrasing themselves. So the shattering, it softens them and broadens them. It can also kill you, like it could just flatline you if you just let it keep deteriorating. But the purpose it's serving is softening the rough edges. And if you stop it at some point, you manage to maintain it, which is what identifying a true center point is, like it's the image of the Beinoni. Then you stop the deterioration process, and from that point forward, which is like the middle of the second trimester, like after the third millennium, right in the middle of Matan Torah. So from that point onwards, you start re-enhancing and recuperating all the grounds you've lost, and even enhancing it more. So that's called Torah. So Torah is stopping the deterioration of the default chaos, and hopefully instituting a true balance which can then recuperate all of the chaotic lights under broader vessels. And that's what we'd call balance. Like if you wanted to describe mental balance, then it would be the ability to maintain as broad edges as possible. Like the more balance you have, and the stronger, like if you have a very stable, intricate identity as a Beinoni, where you can explain the highest high and the lowest low and rationalize it as part of one personality, then you can go very, very high and very, very low. And that's called mental balance. The higher you can go, like the opposite of what today is considered mental balance, which is just an ironing out, a compromise of the personality. So we want to do the exact opposite, even though, like I said, there could very well be a necessary stage. I'm not throwing it out the window, so it's completely evil to allow some compromise. Sometimes you give an acamol, but it's just setting the stage for actual balance, not to confuse the deterioration process with maturity. The deterioration process is just growing old. It's got nothing to do with maturity. Maturity is something that needs to be introduced into the system, because the system by default it's just entropic, like any system. So it's just going to deteriorate. And in order for it to leap out of its ein chadash tachat Hashem, to leap out of its inherent deterioration process, its entropic nature, there has to be introduced an initiated balance, which is what Torah does. So in the coming of Matan Torah, this is what we should all be assuming to do with the Torah. And this is true, again, we gave like a very psychological depiction of this because it's the easiest to relate to. But this is true about everything in creation. The Torah is there to balance inherently entropic systems, and by constituting enough understanding that can contain their edges, and by doing so to stop the deterioration. And then from that point, not only are we not trying to iron it out, the opposite, we actually want to reinstitute the extremes. And so like we said before, the appealing chaos of youth, which was wasted on the young, it comes back. The rejuvenation, like the reimbursement of youth, is the entire concept of Mashiach, is that you have Tchias HaMesim, and that everything not only that everything that died comes back, but there are even new neshamas. Like it even gets more radical. And the key, like the middle core of that, is mamish the pshat of what a Beinoni is in Tanya. So, I mean, this obviously needs more specification of exactly how the Alter Rebbe describes that. Like, what is that image that enables you to understand and cope with the highest high without needing, again, what is a Beinoni? A Beinoni is a person who can have a very high experience without needing to be convinced that he's a tzaddik, because he knows how to, like, he can narrate it to himself in a way that it makes sense that I'm feeling this way even though I'm not a tzaddik. Like, so I don't need to compromise or reassess my identity, even if it's a very high high, and also fall to a very, very low, dark place within himself without it compromising his image of that he had before either. So he knows how to explain it. He has an explanation or an identity that both edges coexist simultaneously within one identity, and it rids that disillusionment sensation which irons you out in life. And like I said, usually you manage to establish such an identity after you've been through enough balance, enough compromise to reach a manageable state. So most 9-year-olds don't don't have the capacity to do this practically. So there is a necessary first trimester of life where there is a chaotic compromise, but then you introduce Torah and you can constitute it and stabilize it, and from that point on you just enhance it. So the more you grow like a tzaddik, the older he gets, the crazier he gets. Anybody who's not a tzaddik, typically. So we should all be that way. Okay, so probably there were like earlier stages where he broke a little bit, but if he caught himself at some point, then from that point onwards, it stops, recuperates, and just goes crazier. And that is mental balance. That's what we're looking to achieve, to drive everybody crazy. that is the aspiration of Chassidus. What the world calls crazy. In the stereotypical way that like the Olam phrases mental balance is just ironing out edges. So if you have compromised edges, then you're balanced, you're mature. But all you are is disillusioned and compromised and depressed. That's all that is. It's just a deterioration process. And maybe in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s, it's reasonable enough to not be completely derogatory, but very soon it becomes mamish depressing. And then eventually it just flatlines because it's a deteriorative process. So there's no balance there. So again, balance has nothing to do with the volume of your edges. It's just a question of how much of a center point you have to be able to maintain them without a disillusioned experience on each edge. That's called balance. And then the more balance you have, the more edges you can contain, not less edges. So a functional balance where you just compromise edges to have a sustainable system that's just compromised. There's no balance there. And that is what we default to. That is like our intuitive default. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying that or you're saying you're going to have nuance aim to get to those highs again. And are you also saying, like hearing right, I also don't hear that. But are you also saying that it's desirable to also be able to get to very low lows?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, maybe even the lows are more valuable than the highs. Definitely.
So I guess maybe I just have this like rainbow colored or rosy colored like vision of like my rabbis and my teachers that have this impression that they don't.
Yeah, that's true. Most rabbis today are very balanced. I said that's true. Most rabbis today are very so-called balanced. Like, yeah, that's how like I said, intuitively, we pick our educators and our leaders by being compromised, mitigated personalities because it provides stability. It's very depressing. It's not a healthy way of life. Yeah.
So, some of the things, from what I'm understanding, can I just introduce some others in which to help myself clarify? So when you were saying that like a child experiences the disillusionment, so I would imagine like there's fear that sets in. I don't want to experience disillusionment, I want to experience that low again. And that's what I'm going to do to self-protect.
Again, it's not the low. It's not the low.
The crash.
It's the disillusionment that's accompanied to the merge from side to side. It's not the low. It's a feeling of being played. It wasn't real. It was delusionary. That's why I'm not willing to go there again. It's not the actual low. Nothing wrong with the low. Lows are great. If you can contain them. Yeah. When you want tension in life, right? It's like a guitar string. If there's no tension, that's the definition of being dead. It's just, well, you need tension. I'm not saying if it's too tense, you can tear the string. But you need to balance it. So it produces a good tune. Tension is vitality. Right? Yira is good, very good. That's what makes life real. So you know what you want? You want to just be flax. It's not. But that's what we tend to call balance. Just being very compromised.
So disillusionment, you mean like a sense of failure?
It's not even necessarily. It's not failure. It's disillusionment. It's what I thought I was wrong. I thought I was a tzaddik. And the same thing happens on the way back. Yes, I thought I was nobody. Why did I feel that way? I just feel I don't trust my interpretation of self anymore. And that scars you. That scars you enough to create an intuitive deterrence from extremes. And that's the reason you start ironing out. So it's just the deterrence, it's not the actual low or the actual high. The opposite. If you were able to do it without the deterrence, you could expand your edges. That's what you want. That's what we want. We want to expand the edges. Yeah. All the way in the back.
A little more about this in terms of the lows. In other words, what I'm understanding that you're saying is it's about our self-concept. Like, can I contain and accept myself with my highs and my lows and all of everything? Like, coming at it with the meaning.
The word accept is a very passive phrase. It won't do the trick. You need to rationalize yourself. Yeah, you need to understand, to have enough of an image of, again, that you feel disillusion when you go from one side to the other is because this edge doesn't make sense under the image you've adopted. Doesn't make sense. It's not part of who you thought you were. And so you need to facilitate your edges. It's not just accepting whatever happens. No, you need to actively facilitate and adopt an image of self, an understanding of self that inherently expects and understands both edges as being inherent parts of who I am. So it's a facilitation. It's not just an acceptance, and that will mitigate the compromise. If you just go for acceptance, then what you'll do is compromise slower. Like it won't be as harsh.
How do we facilitate the low that's when I say acceptable, why would one want to do that and how would you?
I don't even know how to answer that. You just do. Like the example I said before, right? So let's say somebody annoys me now. You're asking too many questions. Stop asking annoying questions. And I burst out at you. And everybody's like, so a second ago I was this very important rabbi giving over psychology, and now I'm just like this schwanz who's completely. Okay, so facilitating that would be assuming that I would intuitively, which I wouldn't, but let's say I would intuitively react to that indifferently. I said, okay, caught me. Sure. If it were to make sense to me, it probably doesn't because I'm delusional, but if I were mentally stable to a certain extent, then it would not be accompanied with a shattering of my image of self. Okay, yeah. Adrabah, you're all very lucky I haven't done it yet because it's so typical. Because that would be a more relevant reaction, which is so counterintuitive that you can understand why I suggested that achieving or maintaining such a such a balanced image of self would probably be feasible only under relatively, at least initially, relatively normal edges. Like when you're in your early stage of life where your highs are so high and your lows are so low, then imagining that you can cultivate such an image of self is just not feasible. So there has to be some ironing out in order to make it feasible to balance it. But again, the ironing out is not part of the balancing process. It's just a necessary, again, just like therapy. So if you feel that you have to give someone a pill, because if you don't, then you won't be able to even start a process because nobody to talk to, right? He's climbing up the wall and knocking his head on the window. Okay, so but that's not part of the process. It's just what's enabling the process. In a sense, it's even hindering the process. It's even counterproductive, in a sense. Now, sometimes, like in any tactical decision, you might have to compromise some grounds to gain other grounds. So it could be like a sensible tactical step, but it's very important to realize that it's not part of balance, and in a sense, it's even counterproductive to balance because it's just consummating the current reality in a sense. So any crutch is like that. Okay, so if you go to a physiotherapist and Chas v'Shalom someone broke his leg, then he'll say that if you never use a crutch, that would be the best. And that's true. Is it feasible? No, it's probably not feasible. But every crutch it also has its counterproductive elements. Okay, so any mitigation of edges, any compromise is counterproductive. Is it a necessary thing to do? Very often. It's like not reasonable to go through life without any compromise. Right? So if your kid falls off the bike tomorrow and he's crying, it's fine to cheer him up. And if he's going a little bit wild, it's fine to calm him down. So you don't need to, right, turn yourself inside out and upside down. But when you hypothesize, in theory, like in the laboratory, not in life, it's very important to conceive of things correctly. So you hypothesize, just like any laboratory, you do it in sterile conditions, and you take one idea, you put it under the microscope, and you ignore all other intricate complications. And even though life is going to be a set of mishmash of circumstance, but when you hypothesize in sterile conditions, and you hypothesize radical concepts. So as a hypothesis, I am willing to say that all compromise is bad. And it's good to understand that way. Does that mean in practice? No, that's not how you practice, because life is complicated and intricate, and there's a lot of variables. But if you hypothesize, if you compromise, if you contaminate your laboratories, then you won't be more capable of navigating life. You'll be less capable of navigating life. So it's very important to maintain a very high resolution clarity in your hypothesis in order for it to be something manageable in actual life. So this is somewhat of a radical depiction of mental balance, not compromising, very critical. Okay, it's important, it's good, it's very good to hypothesize this way. And then what you have is strong tools and very refined, sharp tools that can negotiate a very iffy mishmash of reality. So real life is always going to be very gentle and very just like we know life. But the sharper your hypothesis is, the better you'll be at managing that mishmash. So don't compromise your hypothesis. It's good to have a radical hypothesis. This is the foundation stone of all of Chabad Chasidut. This is why people are also very often uncomfortable around Chabad Chasidut, because the hypothesis is very black and white, very binary, very radical, very unnatural, very demanding, very critical. And life isn't like that. But not just because I happen to be a Chabad Chassid, I really rationally stand by it, that the biggest mistake you can do is contaminate your laboratory. So it's very important to maintain radical hypothesis and to be aware of the difference between hypothesis and reality. That's, yeah.
So, thank you. And it
So-
makes me think of when you refer to an artist, great art has an edge to it. And there's a certain freedom to the edge, and I think it makes me wonder if that freedom is that the artist doesn't end up shrinking, but is able to hold the expansion.
In a utopic world, yes. I've never met that artist yet.
Always phrasing he's an artist, like what does that mean? It's like this.
Okay, so very often what it means is actually that he is unbalanced, which is not good. I mean, it's not. The edges could tear you apart. That's why I said that very often there's a necessity for compromise. So is every artist the Lubavitcher Rebbe? I don't know, maybe. Again, hypothetically, sure. But there's usually a gap between hypothesis and reality. So I'm not pointing at any specific artist or anything, but does every person who has radical edges manifest the ideal utopic concept of messianic or utopic, statistically no, but it's achievable, and that's like the compass we want to zero ourselves around and measure ourselves towards. We should also have, maintain eye contact with reality and know where we stand in relation to this utopic image. So not every artist is necessarily this.
So another thing that brought to mind is that I remember reading in a book that there was this line that mediocrity is the death of society.
Absolutely, I agree.
So that is if people begin to shrink
No.
because of this.
The only thing I disagree is that mediocrity, it's also the death of society, but it also is the result of society. By definition, that's what a society is, an aspiration of mediocrity. And societies die because of that. Both are true, both things are true, but by definition, society is, like, what's the most stereotypical image of psychological compromise is like, you go to a doctor and all he's interested in is to make sure that you can fit into the framework of a 9 to 5, and he'll give you the upper when you need the upper, the down when you need the upper to fit you into society. So that becomes very quickly, even the definition, like the varying definition of mental illness in the FDA is much drastically more affected by where insurance companies pay out and don't pay out in court systems ruling than something that's conducive of individual mental health. It's got nothing, not nothing, I won't say it has nothing to do with mental health, but it's so much like what I define as a mental illness or mental illness. Again, it's by far more defined by social norms and the capacity for society to sustain itself than necessarily the individual mental health of what an individual will benefit from. Okay, but all societal things are like that. That's what you're going to get when you go into big data. You're going to get statistical curves. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't mean that you should personally always iron yourself around that statistical curve. Because statistically, you're never going to be the center of the curve. So it's almost, by definition, never right for any specific person. Even though it would still, if I were running the FDA, I don't know if I'd change anything, because that's how you manage big numbers. But it doesn't mean that I need to be that way or that you need to be that way. Actually, if you understand statistics, nobody needs to be that way. There can't ever be a person that will be that way, by definition. It's just a curve. So that's what society do. Societies mitigate individuals. That's why so many people don't like societies. They're not doing so good either. So I wouldn't go that way either. Yeah.
So, I'm an associate NFT, and I'm seeing clients, the way I associate edges, that a lot of the clients I see, not all of them have PTSD, sustained childhood trauma.
Okay.
So there's an edge, that's the way I'm on it or I'm not on it. And then what they need to embrace is still embrace that hurt in their child, because that child belongs, their inner child belongs to them, as well as embracing all the other successes they have.
Okay. I honestly can't. I don't know.
What you said was they have to embrace the tough parts and the high parts. As part of one person.
Again, as a general rule, but again, every scenario in life is going to be infinitely unique. So it's not. I mean, there's no archetype that you can impose on any person in the world. So it is very important to study and refine the dynamics of how we think, and then forget everything, and hopefully, as much as intuition has been honed, it will play out in a discussion with a person. But there's no like generic rule that will enable you to fit someone into a algorithm that will solve those problems. That's how it works. So I don't know to answer any of those questions about Joe or Chaim. I don't know. I gotta meet him. I don't know how that works. What I could say is that I think, especially for therapists, it's very important to be aware that by default, we always do it wrong. Always. No matter how many lectures you've heard, no matter how many times you thought about it, you will always find yourself doing it wrong. Because that is our default. And the only way to do it right is to realize that. So if you ever entertain the thought that I can intuitively react correctly to a patient, then you are definitely doing damage. 100%. Because by definition, we default wrong. So anything good is always going to be counterintuitive. It's always going to involve a counterintuitive initiative. Now, it doesn't have to be radical, it doesn't have to be game-changing, but it's very important to realize the fluctuations of intuition. Very important, especially for therapists. Okay, but these are like broad topics. Yeah, one more, you had a question in the back? Yeah?
Just going back to the high lows, would you say that, is it accurate to say, am I understanding it correct, to say that you're going to have those and you want to have those, you don't want to define yourself by those? When you're saying that these limits and how we...
Okay, again, I agree, but similarly to what I said before, I'd want to phrase it as a positive initiative and not only a passive compromise. It's more... I'd like to phrase it, I'd be more comfortable phrasing it, not that you don't want to define yourself by the edges, but you want to maintain and establish a definition, a positive definition, that actually contains the edges. So not define yourself, that won't be enough. In all of these, like softening the blow is only going to slow the deterioration, which is good. Managing yourself better, that's fine. I got nothing wrong with that. But if you want to introduce actual balance, then you will have to have an initiated consciousness that maintains the edges, not just doesn't. Right? So no matter how proficient you become at not reacting, eventually, again, it's just like you're not going to reach eternal life or essential longevity just by not getting too sick. Okay, you can prolong life. So we've already prolonged life. Right? People used to die at 40, so we're not doing that anymore. We're doing great. Okay, but that is essentially different from balance. Okay, it's just managing the deterioration in a more proficient manner, which is very important. I'm not mezalzel. That's very good. It's a wonderful thing, and that as humanity is living double the amount of years. That's great. That's a wonderful thing. But it is inherently different than what we're describing. So there's how wrong you manage, and then there's balance. So it would be better to manage less wrong. I agree, but that's not what we're discussing. The same thing about that. It's saying that I don't compromise will always be like trying to soften the blows. But what you actually need to do is introduce a initiated, conscious characterization that in practice contains both edges, not just not identify, but identify as both.
I guess maybe I didn't explain it right. I meant not only by one and not only by the other.
Exactly. Okay, so that I agree with 100%. As both. So what a Beinoni is in Tanya is someone who is also a tzaddik, and that is the exact definition of what a Beinoni is. That he's both. So much so that if you read correctly, then what the Alter Rebbe is actually saying is that if you're not both, then you're unstable. If you're just a tzaddik, just a rasha, or just a tzaddik, that is an unstable state of mind. And there has never been a tzaddik who thought he was just a tzaddik, including the Alter Rebbe himself. So that is the definition of stability. Now, a generation later, your Hasidim might come around and say, "No, you were a tzaddik." Fine, that's just custom. That's Israeli Jewish custom. So, but you never, if you entertain that thought, then you're definitely delusional. It's not. So again, learning through Tanya, that's a whole book. But this is an angle of Tuchab, like some basic concepts. Yeah.
Also, when you're from that society, just kind of naturally gravitates towards that dull middle or that deteriorated, dull down, no excitement, say middle age. At least I think that's my summary.
Yeah, that's all true. Yeah, I agree.
How do you live in those extremes and not be perceived as a psycho in society, right? Because I get really excited. I do a phone in my house and I dance and I sing. If I do that at school, people are going to be like, "Oh, stereo."
Okay, well, first of all, there is a difference. There is such a thing as unbalanced extremes. There definitely are. They can rip you apart. That's not good. But if you manage to balance your extremes, which, as I said before, feasibly will always be preceded by a certain amount of compromise. in order to, again, to reach a maintainable state, then there's no reason to think that you'd be conceived by society in any other way. In general, anything, anybody can say anything, but it wouldn't play out that way. No reason that it would play out that way.
Is there a goal? Is there a possible goal of how society should be? Or are we all?
Yeah, sure. We want everybody to live forever.
That doesn't seem like
We're very utopic as Jews. Really, we have like these insane messianic concepts that we entertain daily, and we actually think they're rational and feasible. We haven't managed to implement them in practice completely yet, but we're on our way. Slowly but surely. B'ezrat Hashem. In everybody's lifetime. Say there. Chaim l'chaim. Kabbalah Satorah b'simcha b'pnimius. B'ezrat Hashem.